Picture this. You're settling in for the night, perhaps with a warm drink ready to let your mind wander through corridors of time most people never think to explore. Tonight, we're diving into 1,000 years of the most captivating stories ever told. Stories so strange, so compelling, that they've survived centuries of wars, plagues, and the relentless march of progress. This is the perfect video to help you unwind. Forget about the modern world's chaos and lose yourself in tales that shaped entire civilizations. So get comfortable, let time slip away, and prepare to discover why these medieval legends and myths continue to haunt us today. In the flickering candlelight of medieval monasteries, scribes carefully preserved stories that would make today's horror writers weep with envy. These weren't just entertainment, they were warnings, explanations for the inexplicable, and sometimes uncomfortable truths wrapped in supernatural packaging. From shape-shifting nobles to dancing plagues that consumed entire towns, from curses that lasted generations to saints who performed miracles that defied every law of nature, the medieval world was a place where the impossible happened with disturbing regularity. What you're about to hear isn't sanitized folklore or children's fairy tales. These are the raw, unfiltered beliefs of people who lived in a world where death lurked around every corner, where the line between reality and nightmare was paper thin, and where survival often depended on understanding forces that science hadn't yet dared to explain. Let's begin with a story that demonstrates just how seriously medieval people took their legends. In the winter of 1484, in the remote village of Krems, Austria, something happened that would change how an entire region viewed the supernatural forever. Heinrich von Nördlingen was not a man given to flights of fancy. A merchant by trade, he'd spent decades travelling the dangerous roads between Austrian towns, dealing with bandits, wolves, and the occasional plague outbreak with the practical efficiency of a man who valued profit over poetry. But on that December night, as snow fell thick enough to muffle even the howling wind, Heinrich encountered something that would turn his ordered world upside down. He'd been travelling from Vienna with a wagon full of fine cloth when his horse began acting strangely. Not the usual skittishness of an animal sensing wolves. This was different. The mare's eyes rolled white, and she refused to move forward on the forest road despite Heinrich's increasingly frustrated commands. That's when he heard it, singing, clear and beautiful, drifting through the snow-laden pines. Now, any sensible person might think this was simply another traveller, perhaps a pilgrim making their way to a distant monastery. But Heinrich had grown up in these mountains. He knew that no human voice could carry so perfectly through a blizzard, and more importantly, he recognised the melody. It was a wedding song his grandmother used to hum, one she'd learned from her grandmother before her, a song that hadn't been heard in these parts for over a century. Following the music against every instinct his practical mind possessed, Heinrich left his wagon and pushed through the deep snow. The singing grew stronger, more urgent, and as he crested a small ridge, he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. In a clearing below, figures danced in a perfect circle around what appeared to be a massive oak tree. But this was no ordinary dance, and these were no ordinary dancers. The figures moved with an otherworldly grace, their feet barely touching the ground, and as Heinrich watched, transfixed, he realised that the snow wasn't settling on them. They cast no shadows in the moonlight, and their clothing seemed to shimmer and shift as if woven from moonbeams themselves. At the centre of their circle, the oak tree pulsed with a soft green light that seemed to emanate from within its ancient bark. Heinrich counted them, 13 figures, neither fully male nor female, their faces beautiful beyond human description, yet somehow terrible in their perfection. And then, as if sensing his presence, they stopped dancing. 13 pairs of eyes turned toward him, and he felt a pull so strong it was almost physical, an overwhelming urge to join their eternal dance. What saved Heinrich von Nördlingen that night was the sound of church bells, the midnight call to prayer from a monastery he later learned was over 20 miles away. The moment the bells began to toll, the figures vanished like smoke, the light from the oak faded, and Heinrich found himself alone in an ordinary forest clearing with nothing but his own footprints in the snow to prove he'd ever been there. But the story doesn't end there. Heinrich returned to Krems a changed man. He sold his business, donated his wealth to the church, and spent the remaining years of his life documenting every legend, every supernatural encounter, every strange tale he could find in the region. His chronicles, preserved in the monastery of Melk, contain over 300 accounts of supernatural encounters, each one carefully verified with multiple witnesses. What makes Heinrich's transformation particularly fascinating is that he wasn't alone. Throughout medieval Europe, practical, educated men were regularly having experiences that challenged everything they thought they knew about reality. These weren't ignorant peasants seeing spirits in every shadow. These were merchants, nobles, scholars, and clergy who encountered phenomena that simply couldn't be explained by the limited science of their time. Consider the case of Geoffrey de Montfort, a Norman knight who served in the court of Henry II of England. Geoffrey was known for his sceptical nature. He'd fought in 3 major battles, witnessed the political machinations of one of England's most ruthless kings, and had little patience for what he called the foolish superstitions of common folk. Yet in the autumn of 1179, Geoffrey experienced something that transformed him from a skeptic into one of medieval England's most dedicated chroniclers of supernatural phenomena. Geoffrey had been tasked with investigating reports of strange happenings at Thornfield Manor, a property the Crown was considering confiscating from a noble family that had fallen out of royal favour. The reports were typical of the sort that usually rolled off Geoffrey's back. Servants claiming to see figures in empty rooms, unexplained sounds, objects moving without cause. Standard excuses Geoffrey assumed from a household trying to avoid eviction by claiming their home was cursed. But Thornfield Manor proved to be anything but standard. The building itself was imposing, a stone fortress that had stood for over 2 centuries, its walls thick enough to withstand any siege, its halls decorated with the spoils of countless military campaigns. Yet from the moment Geoffrey crossed the threshold, he felt something was deeply wrong. The servants, he noticed immediately, were all unusually pale, with dark circles under their eyes as if they hadn't slept properly in months. They moved through their duties with the mechanical precision of people going through familiar motions while their minds were elsewhere. When Geoffrey questioned them, their answers were consistent to an unsettling degree. They all reported the same phenomena occurring at the same times, in the same locations, night after night. Geoffrey decided to investigate personally. On his first night in the manor, he positioned himself in the Great Hall, with a full complement of guards and enough torches to banish every shadow. Nothing happened. The second night, he tried a different approach, stationing himself alone in the library where servants reported seeing a figure in monk's robes reading by candlelight. Again, nothing. It wasn't until the third night that Geoffrey experienced what the servants had been trying to tell him about. He'd fallen asleep in the library despite his best efforts to stay alert, and was awakened by the sound of someone turning pages. By the dying light of his candle, he saw a figure seated at the reading desk, a man in the brown robes of a Franciscan monk calmly reading from a large tome as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Geoffrey's first instinct was to challenge the intruder, but something held him back. The figure seemed almost translucent in the candlelight, and as Geoffrey watched, he realised he could see the chair's wooden backing through the monk's body. More unsettling still, the pages the figure appeared to be reading were blank. Geoffrey could see them clearly from his position, yet the monk continued turning them as if absorbing vital information. For over an hour, Geoffrey watched this impossible scene unfold. The monk read with intense concentration, occasionally making notes with a quill that left no marks on the parchment. When the candle finally guttered out, Geoffrey heard the soft sound of a chair being pushed back, followed by footsteps that grew fainter until they faded entirely. When dawn broke, Geoffrey rushed to examine the reading desk. The book was still there, a chronicle of the manor's history written by Brother Marcus, a Franciscan monk who had served as the family's chaplain over a century earlier. But here's what made Geoffrey's blood run cold. Brother Marcus had died before completing his chronicle, and the book ended abruptly mid-sentence on page 247. Yet Geoffrey distinctly remembered seeing the monk reading much further into the volume. Examining the book more closely, Geoffrey discovered that while the visible pages ended at 247, he could feel additional pages beyond that point. Pages that seemed to exist but couldn't be seen. When he tried to turn to these invisible pages, his fingers passed through them as if they were made of mist. Geoffrey spent the next month at Thornfield, documenting every supernatural occurrence with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to military campaigns. What emerged was a pattern that challenged everything medieval scholars thought they knew about the relationship between the living and the dead. Brother Marcus, it seemed, was trying to complete his unfinished work. The blank pages Geoffrey had seen him reading were slowly being filled with invisible text, a continuation of the chronicle that could only be perceived by the monk himself. Through careful observation and interviews with long-time residents, Geoffrey discovered that this had been happening for over a century. Each night, Brother Marcus returned to add a few more lines to his eternal project, documenting events at Thornfield Manor long after his death. But the truly remarkable discovery came when Geoffrey compared the manor's actual history with the dates Brother Marcus appeared to be working on. The monk wasn't just completing his original chronicle, he was continuing it, recording events that had occurred decades after his death with an accuracy that astounded everyone who investigated the case. Geoffrey's documentation of the Thornfield Manor phenomena became one of the most cited supernatural investigations in medieval literature, not because it proved the existence of ghosts, but because it demonstrated a level of methodical scientific inquiry that wouldn't be seen again until the Renaissance. His approach influenced generations of scholars who found themselves confronting similar unexplained phenomena. The medieval world was full of such careful observers, people who approached the supernatural not with blind faith or superstitious terror, but with a genuine desire to understand forces that lay beyond the boundaries of accepted knowledge. This wasn't ignorance, it was intellectual courage of the highest order. Take the case of Hildegard of Bingen, the remarkable Benedictine abbess who lived in the 12th century. Hildegard was no simple mystic lost in religious ecstasy. She was a composer, philosopher, physician, and naturalist whose scientific observations were centuries ahead of her time. Yet she also claimed to experience visions so vivid and detailed that they've puzzled scholars for nearly 900 years. Hildegard's visions weren't the typical religious revelations of her era. Instead of seeing Christ or the Virgin Mary, she reported encountering beings of living light who showed her the fundamental structures of the universe. She described cosmic forces as vast, interconnected webs of energy, mapped the human body's spiritual anatomy with precision that wouldn't be matched until the development of modern neuroscience, and predicted natural disasters with an accuracy that made her one of the most consulted advisors in medieval Europe. What makes Hildegard's case particularly intriguing is that her visions consistently provided information she couldn't have known through normal means. She described the circulation of blood through the human body centuries before Harvey's discoveries, accurately predicted weather patterns that allowed her monastery to avoid famines that devastated neighbouring regions, and developed medical treatments that proved remarkably effective despite being based on principles that wouldn't be understood until the 20th century. Modern researchers studying Hildegard's detailed descriptions of her visions have noted striking similarities to documented cases of temporal lobe epilepsy, suggesting that her supernatural experiences might have had a neurological component. But this doesn't diminish their significance. If anything, it makes them more fascinating. Hildegard was essentially using altered states of consciousness to access information that lay beyond the normal boundaries of medieval knowledge. Her influence extended far beyond the walls of her monastery. Kings and emperors sought her counsel, not because they believed in her mystical powers, but because her predictions proved accurate with disturbing regularity. She advised Frederick Barbarossa on military strategy, warned Pope Eugene III about political conspiracies before they were discovered by conventional means, and helped numerous noble families avoid disasters that befell their unprepared neighbours. Hildegard's approach to the supernatural was pragmatic rather than devotional. She treated her visions as a source of practical information, testing their accuracy against real-world events and refining her interpretive methods based on results. This systematic approach to supernatural phenomena was surprisingly common among medieval intellectuals, who often viewed unexplained experiences as puzzles to be solved, rather than mysteries to be worshipped. But not all medieval supernatural encounters were so benevolent or intellectually stimulating. Some legends speak of forces so malevolent that they've left scars on the landscape that can still be seen today. In the forests of the Black Forest region of Germany, there stands a circle of 13 ancient oaks, known locally as the Hexenkreis, the Witch's Circle. Local folklore claims these trees mark the site of medieval Germany's most notorious supernatural disaster, an event so traumatic that it's still remembered in whispered conversations nearly 8 centuries later. The story begins in the summer of 1227, when a young woman named Bertha von Seckendorf arrived in the village of Schwarzburg to marry the local lord's eldest son. Bertha was beautiful, intelligent, and came from a noble family with impeccable credentials, exactly the sort of bride any noble house would welcome. But from the moment she arrived, strange things began happening in and around the village. It started with the animals. Horses refused to approach Bertha's chambers, dogs howled through the night whenever she was present, and the village cat disappeared entirely within a week of her arrival. The local priest, Father Dietrich, noticed that holy water seemed to evaporate unusually quickly when Bertha attended Mass, and several villagers reported that crosses worn by their families had begun to tarnish inexplicably. But these minor disturbances were nothing compared to what happened on the night of Bertha's wedding feast. As the celebration reached its height, with over 200 guests dancing in the great hall, every candle in the castle suddenly went out simultaneously. In the darkness that followed, witnesses reported seeing Bertha's eyes glowing with a green light that seemed to emanate from within her skull. When the candles were relit moments later, 13 of the wedding guests had vanished completely. Not just left the hall, vanished. Their clothes remained where they'd been standing, but the people themselves had simply ceased to exist. Among the missing were the bride's own father, 2 of the groom's brothers, and several of the region's most prominent nobles. The investigation that followed revealed details that convinced even the most skeptical observers that they were dealing with forces beyond natural explanation. The missing guests' belongings showed no signs of struggle. Their jewellery, weapons, and personal effects were found neatly arranged as if their owners had simply stepped out of their clothes and walked away naked. More disturbing still, several witnesses swore that in the moment before the candles went out they'd seen the missing people dancing with partners who cast no shadows. Bertha herself claimed to remember nothing of the evening after the feast began. She appeared genuinely distraught by the disappearances and cooperated fully with every investigation. But as the days passed, more disturbing details emerged. Servants reported finding her sleepwalking in the castle's corridors, speaking in languages no one recognized. Guards swore they'd seen her walking through solid walls, and on one memorable occasion, the castle's chaplain claimed to have witnessed her, floating 3 feet above the ground while apparently deep in prayer. The breaking point came 2 weeks after the wedding, when the 13 missing guests reappeared, but not as anyone had hoped. They were found arranged in a perfect circle in the forest clearing that would later be marked by the 13 oaks, each one standing upright as if frozen in mid-dance, their faces locked in expressions of pure terror. They were alive, technically speaking, but completely unresponsive to any attempt at communication. For 3 days and nights, these 13 figures stood motionless in the forest circle, neither eating nor drinking, apparently unaware of their surroundings. Physicians, priests, and scholars examined them extensively, but could find no explanation for their condition. They breathed, their hearts beat, their eyes tracked movement, but they showed no signs of consciousness or recognition. On the 4th day, as the sun reached its zenith, all 13 figures suddenly crumbled to dust simultaneously, leaving nothing but piles of grey ash arranged in a perfect circle. Within hours of their final disappearance, 13 oak saplings sprouted from the ash piles, growing with supernatural speed until they reached full maturity by sunset. Bertha von Seckendorf was never seen again after that day. Some claimed she vanished along with the 13 figures, others insisted she'd fled to a distant monastery to atone for whatever role she'd played in the disaster. But local woodsmen reported seeing a woman matching her description dancing alone in the forest, clearing for decades afterward, always on nights when the moon was dark and the wind carried the sound of distant music through the trees. The Hexenkreis became one of medieval Germany's most studied supernatural sites. Scholars from across Europe travelled to examine the 13 oaks, which displayed properties that defied natural explanation. The trees grew in perfect symmetry, their branches intertwining to form complex geometric patterns that changed with the seasons. They never lost their leaves, never showed signs of disease or insect damage, and wood cut from their branches refused to burn no matter how hot the fire. More unsettling still, people who spent extended time in the circle reported experiencing vivid dreams of dancing with beautiful partners who slowly revealed themselves to be something other than human. Several investigators claimed to have seen additional figures joining Bertha's eternal dance on certain nights, always in groups of 13, always moving to music that seemed to come from the earth itself. The church's response to the Hexenkreis incident was swift and comprehensive. A team of exorcists attempted to cleanse the site, but their rituals had no apparent effect on either the trees or the supernatural phenomena. Eventually, church authorities settled for placing a cordon of blessed stones around the clearing and forbidding anyone from entering the circle after sunset. These restrictions remained in place for over 3 centuries, and local records show that they were generally effective in preventing further supernatural incidents. But the few documented violations of the prohibition resulted in disappearances that followed the same pattern established during Bertha's wedding feast. People would be found days later in the forest circle, alive but unresponsive, only to crumble to dust after exactly 3 days. The Bertha von Seckendorf case demonstrates one of the most disturbing aspects of medieval supernatural encounters, their tendency to create lasting changes in the physical world that persisted long after the original events. Unlike modern ghost stories, which typically involve temporary manifestations that leave no permanent trace, medieval supernatural phenomena often resulted in alterations to the landscape that served as permanent reminders of otherworldly interventions. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout medieval supernatural literature. In France, the ruins of Château de Montségur still bear scorch marks that local legend attributes to supernatural fire that burned for 7 days and nights without consuming any fuel. In England, the village of Woolpit in Suffolk is famous for the Green Children incident, where 2 children with bright green skin appeared in the fields in the 12th century, speaking an unknown language and eating only raw beans until they gradually adapted to human food and lost their unusual coloration. The Green Children of Woolpit represent another category of medieval supernatural encounter, cases where otherworldly beings seem to cross over into our reality and remain there permanently. The 2 children, a boy and a girl, were discovered during harvest time by local reapers, who found them hiding in the ancient wolf pits that gave the village its name. Their skin was bright green all over, they wore clothes made from unfamiliar materials, and they spoke a language that no scholar in England could identify. Initially, the children refused all food except raw broad beans, which they consumed with apparent desperation. The boy weakened rapidly and died within a few months, but the girl gradually adapted to normal food. As she did so, her green coloration slowly faded until she appeared completely human. She learned to speak English and eventually married a local man, living what appeared to be a normal life until her death many decades later. But the girl's account of her origins was anything but normal. She claimed to come from a land where the sun never shone, where everything existed in a perpetual twilight that was neither day nor night. She described vast underground cities populated by people like herself, connected by tunnels that stretched beneath the entire known world. According to her testimony, she and her brother had become lost while exploring these tunnels, and had followed the sound of church bells until they emerged in the wolf pits of Woolpit. What makes the Green Children case particularly fascinating is its extensive documentation. Unlike many medieval supernatural accounts that exist only in folklore or religious texts, the Woolpit incident was recorded by multiple contemporary historians including William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall, both highly respected chroniclers known for their sceptical approach to extraordinary claims. William of Newburgh, in particular, was famous for criticising other historians who included supernatural elements in their chronicles without sufficient evidence. Yet he considered the Green Children case so well documented and the witnesses so credible that he included a detailed account in his Historia Rerum Anglicarum, noting that he had personally interviewed several people who had known the girl in her adult life. The girl herself, who took the Christian name Agnes after her baptism, lived openly in the community for over 40 years after her strange arrival. She married Richard Barr, a minor nobleman, and raised several children who showed no unusual characteristics. Local records indicate that she was generally well regarded by her neighbours, though she was known for her unusual knowledge of medicinal herbs and her ability to predict weather patterns with remarkable accuracy. Agnes occasionally spoke of her homeland to close friends, describing technologies and social structures that wouldn't be seen in medieval England for centuries. She claimed her people used artificial lighting that never grew dim, had methods of communication that allowed them to speak with others across vast distances, and possessed detailed maps of the entire world, including lands that wouldn't be discovered by European explorers for another 300 years. Modern researchers have proposed various explanations for the Green Children incident, ranging from cases of arsenic poisoning causing unusual skin coloration to the possibility that Agnes and her brother were refugees from a distant land with unusual customs. But none of these theories adequately explain the children's initial inability to eat normal food, their complete ignorance of Christianity in a thoroughly Christian society, or Agnes's later knowledge of geographical and technological information that was centuries ahead of her time. The Green Children case illustrates one of the most intriguing aspects of medieval supernatural encounters, their tendency to blur the lines between the impossible and the merely improbable. Medieval chroniclers approached such cases with a sophisticated understanding that reality might be far more complex than their limited knowledge could encompass. This intellectual humility in the face of unexplained phenomena was perhaps medieval scholarship's greatest strength. Rather than dismissing supernatural encounters as impossible, medieval thinkers developed elaborate theoretical frameworks for understanding how such events might fit into a rational, ordered universe. They didn't see science and the supernatural as opposing forces, but as different aspects of a reality that was vast enough to contain both natural laws and occasional exceptions to those laws. Consider the approach taken by Albertus Magnus, the 13th century philosopher and scientist who is often called the father of experimental science. Albertus spent decades investigating reports of supernatural phenomena, not to debunk them, but to understand how they might operate according to principles that humans hadn't yet discovered. His treatise De Mineralibus includes detailed descriptions of stones and metals that supposedly possessed supernatural properties, but Albertus approached these claims as a scientist rather than a believer. He developed rigorous testing procedures for evaluating supernatural claims, insisted on multiple witnesses for extraordinary events, and maintained detailed records of his investigations. When he encountered phenomena that couldn't be explained by existing knowledge, he didn't dismiss them as impossible. Instead, he classified them as areas requiring further study. This scientific approach to the supernatural led to some remarkable discoveries. Albertus Magnus was among the first European scholars to describe the properties of lodestone magnetism, which appeared supernatural to people unfamiliar with magnetic fields. He correctly identified several supposed miracle cures as the result of previously unknown medicinal properties in certain plants and minerals, and he developed early theories about optical illusions and psychological phenomena that wouldn't be fully understood until the development of modern psychology. But Albertus also encountered phenomena that resisted rational explanation even by his advanced standards. His journals describe several cases where he observed events that seemed to violate fundamental physical laws, objects moving without apparent cause, people displaying knowledge they couldn't have acquired through normal means, and substances changing their properties in ways that couldn't be replicated under controlled conditions. Rather than abandoning his scientific principles when confronted with such cases, Albertus developed what he called the theory of hidden virtues, the idea that all matter possessed properties and potentials that hadn't yet been discovered or understood. This approach allowed him to maintain both his commitment to rational inquiry and his openness to phenomena that lay beyond current understanding. Albertus's influence on medieval thought was enormous. His students included Thomas Aquinas, and his methodical approach to investigating supernatural claims became the standard for medieval scholars throughout Europe. This created a unique intellectual environment where supernatural phenomena were studied with the same rigor applied to mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy. The results of this scholarly attention to supernatural phenomena can be seen in the remarkable sophistication of medieval supernatural literature. Rather than simple folk tales or religious propaganda, medieval supernatural accounts often read like detailed case studies, complete with witness testimony, physical evidence, and attempts to understand the mechanisms behind extraordinary events. Take the case of the dancing plague of 1518, which occurred in Strasbourg and was documented by multiple physicians, city officials, and religious authorities. What began as a single woman dancing uncontrollably in the city's main square eventually affected over 400 people, who danced continuously for days without food, rest, or apparent awareness of their surroundings. The dancing plague wasn't dismissed as mass hysteria or demonic possession, as might be expected in a less sophisticated society. Instead, Strasbourg's authorities approached it as a medical emergency, requiring careful study and intervention. They consulted physicians, brought in musicians based on theories about therapeutic music, and maintained detailed records of the afflicted individual's symptoms and behaviours. The city's official chronicle describes the dancing plague as beginning on July 14th, 1518, when a woman known as Frau Trophea began dancing in the narrow street near the local guild hall. Her movements were described as frantic and involuntary, as if she were being controlled by an external force. Attempts to restrain her proved unsuccessful. She would break free and resume dancing with even greater intensity. Within a week, 34 other people had joined Frau Trophea's involuntary dance. Within a month, the number had grown to approximately 400. The dancers moved constantly, day and night, their feet bleeding from continuous movement, their faces showing signs of exhaustion and terror, but their bodies unable to stop the relentless motion. City authorities initially tried what they believed to be a logical solution. They hired musicians and built a stage, thinking that providing proper music and space for dancing would help the afflicted work through whatever was compelling them. This approach backfired spectacularly, as the music seemed to intensify the dancers' movements and attract even more people to join the growing crowd of involuntary dancers. Local physicians examined the dancers extensively, documenting symptoms that defied medical explanation. The afflicted individuals showed signs of severe physical exhaustion, but continued dancing with superhuman stamina. They appeared to be in some form of trance state, unresponsive to friends and family members, yet their movements remained coordinated and rhythmical rather than random or convulsive. More disturbing still, several witnesses reported that the dancers' movements seemed to follow patterns that changed in unison, as if they were all responding to the same unheard music. These pattern changes occurred simultaneously across the entire group, even when the dancers were separated by considerable distances and couldn't see each other. The plague continued for over 2 months before gradually subsiding in September 1518. By that time, several dozen dancers had died from exhaustion, heart attacks, or strokes brought on by continuous physical exertion. The survivors gradually regained control of their movements, but many reported having no memory of the weeks they'd spent dancing, describing the experience as if they'd been asleep the entire time. Modern medical historians have proposed various explanations for the dancing plague, including ergot poisoning from contaminated grain, mass psychogenic illness, or early descriptions of neurological conditions like Huntington's disease. But none of these theories adequately explain the synchronized nature of the dancers' movements, the duration of the episode, or the fact that similar dancing plagues were reported in dozens of other European cities during the same period. The dancing plague represents one of the most thoroughly documented supernatural events in medieval history, yet it remains as mysterious today as it was 5 centuries ago. What makes it particularly significant is how it was handled by the authorities of Strasbourg, not as a religious matter requiring exorcism or punishment, but as a medical crisis requiring careful observation and rational intervention. This scientific approach to supernatural phenomena was characteristic of late medieval thought, which had developed sophisticated frameworks for understanding the relationship between natural and supernatural causes. Medieval scholars didn't see these as mutually exclusive categories, but as different levels of causation that could operate simultaneously. The concept of multiple levels of causation allowed medieval thinkers to accept supernatural explanations without abandoning rational inquiry. They could acknowledge that an event might have both a supernatural cause and a natural mechanism, both a spiritual significance and a physical manifestation. This intellectual flexibility enabled them to investigate supernatural phenomena with genuine scientific rigour, while remaining open to explanations that lay beyond the boundaries of current knowledge. This approach is perhaps best exemplified in the extensive medieval literature on miraculous healings and medical interventions attributed to supernatural causes. Rather than simply accepting or rejecting such claims, medieval physicians developed elaborate procedures for evaluating alleged miracles, distinguishing between genuine supernatural healings and cases that might have natural explanations. The medical school at Salerno, one of medieval Europe's most advanced centres of learning, required its physicians to maintain detailed records of any unusual healing they encountered. These records, many of which survive today, show a remarkable commitment to objective observation and systematic analysis. Physicians documented not only successful treatments, but also failed attempts, unusual symptoms, and cases where conventional medicine proved inadequate. Among these records are numerous accounts of healings that appeared to involve supernatural intervention. But rather than simply attributing such cases to divine or demonic influence, Salerno's physicians attempted to understand the mechanisms behind extraordinary healings, developing theories about the relationship between faith, expectation, and physical recovery that wouldn't be seriously studied again until the 20th century. One particularly well-documented case involved a young woman named Isabella da Salerno, who suffered from what medieval physicians described as a wasting disease that left her unable to eat solid food and caused her to lose weight rapidly despite all attempts at treatment. Isabella's condition was examined by multiple physicians over several months, and their detailed records described symptoms that closely match what modern medicine would recognize as severe anorexia nervosa. After conventional treatments failed, Isabella's family brought her to the shrine of St. Matthew in Salerno, where she reportedly experienced a miraculous healing during prayer. But rather than simply accepting this as a divine intervention, the city's physicians conducted a thorough follow-up investigation to understand what had actually happened. Their examination revealed that Isabella's recovery, while sudden and dramatic, followed specific patterns that suggested possible natural mechanisms. Her ability to eat solid food returned gradually rather than instantaneously. Her weight gain followed normal physiological patterns, and her psychological state showed improvements that correlated with her physical recovery in ways that suggested complex interactions between mental and physical health. The Salerno physicians concluded that Isabella's healing might indeed have involved supernatural intervention, but they argued that such intervention worked through natural processes rather than bypassing them entirely. This sophisticated understanding of the relationship between supernatural and natural causes allowed them to study miraculous healings as genuine medical phenomena worthy of scientific investigation. This approach to supernatural healing had profound practical implications. Medieval physicians who understood the potential role of faith, hope, and expectation in recovery were often more effective healers than those who relied purely on physical treatments. They developed therapeutic approaches that engaged their patients' spiritual and emotional resources alongside conventional medical interventions, achieving success rates that impressed even skeptical observers. The integration of supernatural and natural healing approaches reached its most sophisticated expression in the work of medieval Islamic physicians like Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna. Ibn Sina's medical texts, which were used throughout medieval Europe, described healing as involving physical, mental, and spiritual components that needed to be addressed simultaneously for optimal results. Ibn Sina's approach to supernatural healing was rigorously empirical. He maintained detailed case studies of patients who had experienced what appeared to be miraculous recoveries, analysing the circumstances surrounding such healings to identify factors that might contribute to extraordinary outcomes. His work identified several conditions that seemed to increase the likelihood of sudden, dramatic recoveries: strong social support networks, deep religious faith, specific psychological states, and certain environmental factors. More importantly, Ibn Sina developed practical methods for creating conditions conducive to extraordinary healing. His hospitals incorporated music, art, and architectural elements designed to inspire hope and confidence. His treatment protocols included psychological counselling alongside physical therapy. And his training programs for physicians emphasized the importance of treating patients as complete human beings rather than simply collections of symptoms. The success of Ibn Sina's integrated approach to healing was demonstrated repeatedly in medieval hospitals throughout the Islamic world and later in European medical centres that adopted his methods. Patients treated according to his protocols showed higher recovery rates, fewer complications, and greater satisfaction with their care than those receiving purely conventional treatment. But perhaps most significantly, Ibn Sina's work demonstrated that supernatural phenomena could be studied and understood without being dismissed or demystified. His approach acknowledged that healing might involve forces beyond current scientific understanding while maintaining rigorous standards for observation and analysis. This intellectual balance between openness to the extraordinary and commitment to rational inquiry characterized the best of medieval scholarship and allowed medieval thinkers to make remarkable progress in understanding phenomena that modern science is only beginning to investigate seriously. The medieval period's sophisticated approach to supernatural phenomena extended beyond healing to encompass systematic studies of apparitions, prophecy, and otherworldly encounters. Medieval scholars developed elaborate taxonomies for classifying different types of supernatural experiences, criteria for evaluating the reliability of supernatural claims, and theoretical frameworks for understanding how otherworldly forces might interact with the natural world. One of the most comprehensive medieval investigations of supernatural phenomena was conducted by the University of Paris in the 13th century, following a series of apparition sightings that had disrupted academic life in the city. Rather than dismissing these reports or accepting them uncritically, the university assembled a commission of theologians, philosophers, and natural scientists to conduct a systematic investigation. The commission's work, which continued for over 3 years, established many of the principles that would guide scholarly investigation of supernatural phenomena throughout the medieval period. They insisted on multiple independent witnesses for any extraordinary claim, required physical evidence wherever possible, and developed sophisticated methods for distinguishing between genuine supernatural encounters and cases involving hallucination, fraud, or misinterpretation of natural phenomena. The University of Paris investigation was prompted by reports that the spirit of a deceased master, Guillaume de Saint-Amour, had been appearing regularly in the university's lecture halls, apparently continuing to teach philosophy to students who gathered to hear his posthumous lectures. These appearances had been going on for several months and were witnessed by dozens of students and faculty members, including several who'd been strongly sceptical of supernatural claims. The Commission's investigation revealed a complex situation that defied simple explanation. Multiple witnesses confirmed that a figure resembling Guillaume de Saint-Amour had indeed been appearing in various university buildings, delivering lectures on philosophical topics that the historical Guillaume had never addressed during his lifetime. The apparition's teachings displayed knowledge of recent philosophical developments that had occurred after Guillaume's death, suggesting this wasn't simply a case of collective memory or wishful thinking. What made the case particularly compelling was the quality of the posthumous lectures themselves. Students who attended these supernatural seminars reported that the apparition's teaching was superior to Guillaume's work during his lifetime, displaying insights and analytical capabilities that surpassed even his most brilliant earlier performances. Several masters admitted that they had learned genuinely new philosophical concepts from these ghostly lectures. The Commission's investigation employed remarkably sophisticated methodology. They stationed observers in multiple locations simultaneously to verify that the apparition couldn't be explained by someone impersonating the deceased master. They tested the figure's knowledge by asking questions about philosophical problems that had emerged after Guillaume's death, and they carefully documented the apparition's physical characteristics, noting details that could be verified against contemporary descriptions of the living Guillaume. Their findings were both fascinating and disturbing. The apparition possessed intimate knowledge of Guillaume's personal life, including details that had never been shared publicly. It correctly answered questions about private conversations Guillaume had held with colleagues shortly before his death. But it also demonstrated familiarity with philosophical works that had been written years after Guillaume's passing, and it engaged with contemporary intellectual debates as if it had been following scholarly developments throughout the intervening period. Perhaps most unsettling, the apparition seemed to be aware of being investigated. It would acknowledge the presence of commission members during lectures, sometimes addressing their unspoken questions before they could be voiced aloud. On one memorable occasion, it delivered a lecture specifically about the nature of posthumous existence, as if responding directly to the Commission's inquiry into its own reality. The University of Paris investigation concluded that they had encountered a genuine supernatural phenomenon that couldn't be explained by fraud, hallucination, or natural causes. But rather than simply accepting this as a miraculous occurrence, they used the case to develop more sophisticated theories about the relationship between consciousness, knowledge, and physical existence. Their final report, which influenced European intellectual thought for centuries, proposed that consciousness might survive bodily death under certain circumstances, particularly when the deceased individual had been deeply committed to the pursuit of knowledge. They theorized that strong intellectual passion might create a form of spiritual momentum that allowed consciousness to continue operating in the physical world even after the body's demise. This theory had profound implications for medieval understanding of education, intellectual responsibility, and the nature of scholarly work. If consciousness could indeed survive death and continue learning, then the pursuit of knowledge took on eternal significance. Scholars who accepted the University of Paris findings began to view their intellectual work not as temporary activities confined to their mortal lifespans, but as contributions to an ongoing cosmic conversation that might continue indefinitely. The Guillaume de Saint-Amour case also established important precedents for investigating supernatural phenomena in academic settings. The Commission's methodology became a model for similar investigations throughout medieval Europe, creating a tradition of scholarly inquiry into otherworldly encounters that persisted well into the Renaissance period. But not all medieval supernatural investigations reached such measured conclusions. Some cases revealed phenomena so disturbing that they challenged the very foundations of medieval worldview and forced scholars to confront possibilities that were almost too terrible to contemplate. In the winter of 1348, as the Black Death ravaged Europe and killed perhaps a third of the continent's population, reports began reaching major universities of supernatural encounters that seemed directly connected to the plague's devastating progress. These weren't simple ghost sightings or religious visions, but systematic supernatural interventions that appeared designed to spread the disease more effectively than natural transmission alone could accomplish. The most thoroughly documented of these plague-related supernatural incidents occurred in the German city of Lübeck, where city records describe encounters with figures that seem to embody death itself. These beings, described as tall, gaunt figures dressed in physicians' robes, but with faces that appeared to be nothing but shadow beneath their hoods, were reportedly seen entering homes shortly before entire families succumbed to plague symptoms. What made the Lübeck incidents particularly disturbing was their systematic nature. The shadowy figures didn't appear randomly. They seemed to follow specific patterns, visiting households in a precise order that suggested supernatural intelligence rather than random supernatural manifestation. City officials who tracked these appearances discovered that the figures always visited the wealthiest homes first, then worked their way through the population in descending order of social status. Even more unsettling, the figures appeared to be carrying out some form of census or inventory. Witnesses who observed them from hiding reported that the beings would spend considerable time in each household they visited, moving from room to room as if cataloguing possessions or inhabitants. They showed particular interest in books, artwork and religious artifacts, sometimes spending hours examining items that seemed to hold special significance. The connection between these supernatural visitations and plague deaths was impossible to ignore. Families visited by the shadow figures invariably succumbed to the Black Death within days of the encounter, and their deaths often followed patterns that differed from typical plague progression. Instead of the usual symptoms developing gradually over a week or more, victims of the supernatural plague died within 48 hours, often showing signs of terror that suggested they had experienced something far worse than normal disease. Lübeck City Council, desperate to understand and combat this supernatural plague enhancement, commissioned Brother Andreas von Bremen, a Franciscan monk known for his scholarship and practical approach to investigation, to conduct a thorough study of the phenomena. Brother Andreas had previously investigated several supernatural cases and had developed a reputation for methodical, fearless inquiry into otherworldly matters. Brother Andreas's investigation of the Lübeck supernatural plague lasted 6 months and nearly cost him his life on multiple occasions. His detailed journals, preserved in the city archives, describe encounters with supernatural forces that seemed actively hostile to his investigation. The shadow figures apparently became aware of his activities and began targeting him directly, appearing in his cell at night and following him through the city streets during his daily rounds. What Brother Andreas discovered challenged everything medieval scholars thought they understood about the relationship between supernatural and natural disasters. The shadow figures weren't simply spreading plague, they were harvesting something from their victims, some essential quality that seemed to be more valuable to them than mere death. Brother Andreas observed that victims of supernatural plague encounters showed signs of spiritual as well as physical depletion, as if something fundamental had been drained from their being along with their lives. More disturbing still, Brother Andreas discovered evidence suggesting that the shadow figures were stockpiling whatever they harvested from plague victims. His investigation led him to abandoned buildings throughout Lübeck, where he found strange accumulations of what he described as crystallized human essence, materials that glowed with faint inner light and seemed to contain compressed memories, emotions, and spiritual energy extracted from the dead. Brother Andreas's attempts to understand the purpose behind this supernatural harvesting led him into increasingly dangerous territory. He began experiencing visions that showed him glimpses of vast otherworldly realms where beings similar to the shadow figures were engaged in what appeared to be some form of cosmic conflict. These visions suggested that the Black Death wasn't merely a natural disaster, but one front in a supernatural war that encompassed multiple dimensions of reality. The implications of Brother Andreas's discoveries were so disturbing that he initially hesitated to share them with secular or religious authorities. If the Black Death was indeed being manipulated by supernatural forces for purposes that transcended human understanding, then conventional responses to the plague, medical treatments, religious rituals, social reforms, might be entirely inadequate to address the true scope of the crisis. Eventually, Brother Andreas decided to share his findings with a small circle of trusted scholars, including representatives from universities in Paris, Oxford, and Bologna. Their collaborative analysis of his evidence led to one of medieval Europe's most significant but least publicised intellectual achievements: the development of comprehensive theoretical frameworks for understanding supernatural warfare and its impact on natural disasters. These scholars concluded that human society might be caught in the middle of conflicts between supernatural forces that operated according to principles and motivations that humans could barely comprehend. Natural disasters like plagues, famines, and earthquakes might be symptoms of these cosmic conflicts, rather than random occurrences or divine punishments. This understanding had profound practical implications. If supernatural forces were indeed capable of manipulating natural disasters for their own purposes, then human survival might depend on developing better methods for detecting and countering such interventions. The scholars began developing what they called spiritual defensive measures, techniques for protecting communities from supernatural manipulation during times of crisis. These defensive measures combined conventional medical and social responses with supernatural countermeasures based on their analysis of how otherworldly forces seem to operate. They developed early warning systems for detecting supernatural intervention, community organization techniques designed to minimize vulnerability to spiritual harvesting, and protective rituals that seemed to interfere with supernatural entities' ability to operate effectively in human environments. The effectiveness of these spiritual defensive measures was demonstrated during subsequent plague outbreaks. Communities that implemented the scholars' recommendations showed significantly lower mortality rates than neighbouring areas that relied solely on conventional approaches to plague prevention. More importantly, these protected communities reported far fewer supernatural encounters during plague periods, suggesting that their defensive measures were indeed interfering with otherworldly manipulation. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of Brother Andreas's investigation was its influence on medieval understanding of human agency in the face of supernatural forces. Previous approaches to otherworldly encounters had emphasized submission, acceptance, or appeals for divine intervention. The Lübeck investigation suggested that humans might be capable of actively resisting supernatural manipulation through intelligent application of appropriate countermeasures. This shift from passive acceptance to active resistance marked a crucial turning point in medieval supernatural studies. Scholars began developing increasingly sophisticated methods for analysing supernatural threats, designing effective countermeasures, and protecting human communities from otherworldly interference. These developments laid important groundwork for later advances in natural science, which would eventually provide alternative explanations for many phenomena previously attributed to supernatural causes. However, some medieval supernatural encounters proved so complex and persistent that they continued to defy explanation even as human understanding of natural phenomena advanced. These cases suggest that medieval people may indeed have been dealing with forces that operated according to principles fundamentally different from those governing the physical world. Consider the centuries-long supernatural siege of Castello di Dolceacqua, a fortified castle in northwestern Italy that became the focus of one of medieval Europe's most persistent and well-documented supernatural conflicts. The siege began in 1145 when the castle's lord, Oberto Doria, refused to surrender a mysterious prisoner to forces that appeared to be neither fully human nor entirely otherworldly. The prisoner, known only as the Silent One, had been captured during a raid on what the castle's soldiers thought was a bandit encampment in the surrounding mountains. But the Silent One proved to be unlike any captive the soldiers had ever encountered. He appeared to be a young man of perhaps 20 years, but his captors soon discovered that he cast no reflection in mirrors, left no footprints even in soft ground, and required no food or water to remain apparently healthy and alert. More disturbing still, the Silent One's presence seemed to affect the castle's environment in subtle but persistent ways. Metal objects began to tarnish more rapidly than normal, stone walls developed hairline cracks that followed geometric patterns, and the castle's wells began to produce water that tasted faintly of copper, despite showing no signs of contamination when examined by the best physicians available. Umberto Doria's decision to keep the Silent One imprisoned, rather than release him to his supernatural pursuers, triggered a siege that would continue for over 2 centuries. The besiegers weren't conventional military forces. They were beings that appeared to shift between human and non-human forms, operating according to rules that seemed to belong to some otherworldly code of warfare rather than conventional military principles. The supernatural siege of Castello di Dolceacqua followed patterns that evolved over time but maintained consistent characteristics that distinguished it from normal military conflicts. The besiegers appeared only during certain phases of the moon, always in groups that numbered multiples of 7, and they seemed more interested in maintaining psychological pressure than in achieving immediate military victory through conventional assault. Their tactics included surrounding the castle with illusions that made the familiar landscape appear alien and threatening, creating false sounds that suggested massive armies were approaching from multiple directions, and generating atmospheric effects that made day seem like twilight and caused stars to appear in patterns that didn't match any known constellations. The castle's defenders adapted to this supernatural warfare by developing countermeasures that combined conventional military techniques with spiritual defensive measures. They learned to distinguish between genuine threats and supernatural illusions, developed early warning systems that could detect the approach of otherworldly forces, and established communication protocols that allowed them to maintain morale despite the constant psychological pressure of the siege. What made the Castello di Dolceacqua siege particularly significant was its documentation by multiple generations of scholars who treated it as a unique opportunity to study supernatural warfare under controlled conditions. The University of Genoa established a permanent research station near the castle in 1203, and for over a century students and masters took turns observing the siege and documenting its evolving patterns. These scholarly observers discovered that the supernatural siege operated according to complex rules that seemed to combine elements of human warfare with principles drawn from some otherworldly legal system. The besiegers appeared to be bound by constraints that prevented them from simply overwhelming the castle's defences, suggesting they were operating under some form of supernatural treaty or code that limited their actions. More intriguingly, the researchers discovered that the siege's intensity varied in response to specific actions taken by the castle's inhabitants. Attempts to harm or interrogate the Silent One resulted in immediate escalation of supernatural pressure, while efforts to improve his living conditions or show him respect led to temporary reductions in siege activity. This discovery led to one of medieval scholarship's most sophisticated analyses of supernatural justice and otherworldly legal systems. The University of Genoa scholars concluded that the siege represented not random supernatural harassment, but enforcement of some form of otherworldly law that governed the treatment of beings like the Silent One. Their analysis suggested that supernatural forces might operate according to complex legal and ethical systems that paralleled but didn't necessarily align with human concepts of justice. The Silent One appeared to be under some form of otherworldly protection that his captors had violated by imprisoning him, and the siege represented an attempt to enforce supernatural law through what amounted to a cosmic legal proceeding. This understanding transformed the castle's approach to managing the siege. Instead of viewing it purely as a military conflict, they began treating it as a legal dispute that might be resolved through negotiation rather than force. They developed communication protocols for interacting with the besiegers, established procedures for demonstrating their good intentions regarding the Silent One's treatment, and created frameworks for potentially negotiating a resolution to the supernatural conflict. These diplomatic approaches to supernatural warfare proved remarkably effective. The siege's intensity decreased significantly as the castle's inhabitants demonstrated their willingness to treat the Silent One according to what appeared to be otherworldly standards of prisoner care. The supernatural forces began responding to diplomatic overtures with increasingly sophisticated communications that suggested the possibility of eventual resolution. The breakthrough came in 1267 when the castle's scholars succeeded in establishing direct communication with the siege's leaders. Through a complex series of symbolic exchanges and carefully structured rituals, they learned that the Silent One was indeed under otherworldly protection, and that his continued imprisonment violated supernatural law in ways that required resolution. However, the supernatural forces acknowledged that the castle's inhabitants had captured the Silent One in good faith, without knowledge of his protected status. This created a complex legal situation that required negotiated resolution rather than simple enforcement of otherworldly justice. The final resolution of the Castello di Dolciacqua siege established important precedents for human supernatural diplomatic relations that influenced medieval approaches to otherworldly encounters for centuries afterward. The agreement reached in 1349 allowed the Silent One to be released to his supernatural guardians, while providing compensation to the castle for the damages suffered during the siege and establishing protocols for avoiding similar conflicts in the future. More significantly, the agreement created formal diplomatic channels between human and supernatural authorities that could be used to resolve future conflicts without resorting to supernatural warfare. These diplomatic frameworks proved invaluable during subsequent encounters between human communities and otherworldly forces, preventing numerous potential conflicts from escalating into the kind of prolonged supernatural siege that had characterized the Dolciacqua situation. The Silent One's release was accomplished through an elaborate ceremony that demonstrated the sophisticated nature of supernatural diplomatic protocols. Representatives from multiple otherworldly factions participated in the transfer, each following precise ritual requirements that seemed designed to ensure that all supernatural legal obligations were properly fulfilled. The ceremony itself provided medieval observers with unprecedented insights into supernatural social structures and otherworldly cultural practices. The beings involved in the Silent One's release displayed hierarchical organization, complex ceremonial traditions, and sophisticated understanding of both human and supernatural legal principles. Most importantly, the successful resolution of the Dolciacqua siege demonstrated that supernatural conflicts weren't necessarily inevitable or unresolvable. With sufficient understanding of otherworldly perspectives and adequate commitment to diplomatic solutions, humans could negotiate successful resolutions to even the most complex supernatural disputes. This realization had profound implications for medieval approaches to otherworldly encounters. Instead of viewing supernatural forces as inherently hostile or incomprehensible, medieval scholars began developing more nuanced understandings of otherworldly motivations and more sophisticated methods for managing human supernatural relations. The diplomatic precedents established during the Dolciacqua Resolution influenced medieval supernatural policy for centuries, creating frameworks for peaceful coexistence between human and otherworldly communities that prevented countless potential conflicts from developing into destructive supernatural warfare. But even as medieval scholars developed increasingly sophisticated approaches to managing supernatural encounters, some phenomena continued to challenge the boundaries of human understanding and push medieval society to confront possibilities that seemed to transcend all known categories of experience. In the mountains of northern Wales, the Abbey of Courmayeur became the centre of one of medieval Europe's most profound and transformative supernatural encounters, an event that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of time, reality, and human consciousness in ways that continue to resonate in modern discussions of consciousness and temporal mechanics. The Shumir temporal anomaly, as it came to be known among scholars, began in the autumn of 1284 when Brother Dafydd ap Gruffudd, the Abbey's librarian, began experiencing what he initially dismissed as particularly vivid dreams. These dreams seemed to transport him to different historical periods, allowing him to witness events from the Abbey's past and future with extraordinary clarity and detail. Initially, Brother Dafydd treated these experiences as spiritual visions sent by God to provide him with guidance in his scholarly work. Medieval monasteries were familiar with monks who experienced prophetic dreams or mystical visions, and Dafydd's superiors saw no cause for concern when he began incorporating historical details from his visions into his chronicles of the Abbey's development. However, the situation became more complex when other monks began experiencing similar temporal displacements. Within months of Dafydd's initial experiences, over a dozen brothers reported dreamlike episodes where they found themselves witnessing or participating in events from different time periods. These weren't vague, symbolic visions. They were detailed, consistent experiences that provided specific historical information that could be verified through documentary research. What made the Courmayeur experiences particularly remarkable was their accuracy and consistency. Different monks experiencing temporal displacements to the same historical periods reported identical details about events, people, and circumstances. Their accounts matched perfectly with historical records, even when those records weren't available in the Abbey's library, and couldn't have been known to the monks through normal means. More intriguingly, monks who experienced displacements to future time periods provided information about events that hadn't yet occurred, but later proved to be accurate. Brother Daffod's vision of a great fire that would destroy part of the Abbey's library was initially dismissed as anxiety about the safety of the manuscripts in his care. But when a lightning strike caused exactly the fire he had described, occurring precisely as he had foreseen, the Abbey's authorities began taking the temporal experiences more seriously. The Khmer temporal anomaly attracted attention from scholars throughout Britain and continental Europe. The Abbey became a centre for research into the nature of time, consciousness, and the relationship between spiritual experience and historical reality. Teams of investigators from universities in Oxford, Cambridge, and Paris established residence at the Abbey to study the temporal displacements under controlled conditions. What they discovered challenged fundamental medieval assumptions about the linear nature of time and the boundaries of human consciousness. The temporal experiences weren't random or chaotic. They followed specific patterns that suggested time might be far more complex and accessible than conventional understanding indicated. Monks experiencing temporal displacements reported that past and future events seemed to coexist simultaneously in some dimension of reality that normal consciousness couldn't access. They described being able to move through time as easily as walking through the Abbey's corridors, experiencing different historical periods as discrete locations in a vast temporal landscape rather than as sequential moments in a linear progression. These experiences provided unprecedented insights into historical events that had occurred centuries before any living witness could remember them. The monks' temporal journeys revealed details about the Abbey's founding, the lives of long-dead abbots, and the circumstances surrounding historical events that had been lost to conventional historical records. But perhaps most significantly, the temporal displacements provided information about future developments that proved remarkably accurate when those futures became present reality. The monks' visions of political changes, natural disasters, and social developments proved so reliable that secular authorities began consulting the Abbey's temporal visionaries for strategic planning purposes. The scholarly investigation of the Khmer temporal anomaly led to revolutionary developments in medieval understanding of consciousness, time, and the nature of reality itself. The researchers concluded that human consciousness might be capable of accessing multiple temporal dimensions under certain conditions, suggesting that the conventional experience of linear time might be a limitation rather than a fundamental aspect of reality. This understanding had profound implications for medieval philosophy, theology, and natural science. If consciousness could indeed transcend temporal boundaries, then human knowledge and experience might be far less limited than previously assumed. The possibility of accessing past and future information through consciousness expansion opened entirely new avenues for scholarly investigation and practical application. The Khmer discoveries influenced medieval thought in ways that persisted well into the Renaissance period and beyond. The Abbey's temporal research attracted students from throughout Europe who wanted to learn techniques for expanding consciousness and accessing non-linear temporal experience. These students carried their knowledge back to their home countries, establishing centres for temporal research throughout the medieval academic world. However, the Khmer temporal anomaly also demonstrated the potential dangers of uncontrolled consciousness expansion. Several monks who attempted to replicate the temporal displacement experiences without proper preparation suffered what appeared to be severe psychological damage, becoming lost in temporal confusion and unable to distinguish between past, present, and future experiences. These casualties led to the development of rigorous safety protocols for temporal consciousness research. The Abbey scholars created training programs that prepared researchers for temporal displacement experiences, established guidelines for managing consciousness expansion safely, and developed techniques for helping individuals who became temporally disoriented to return to normal linear time perception. The safety measures developed at Khmer became standard practice for medieval consciousness research throughout Europe. These protocols proved essential for preventing temporal displacement experiences from becoming dangerous or destructive, allowing scholars to continue investigating consciousness and time while minimizing the risks associated with such research. The Khmer temporal anomaly continued to influence individuals and events for over a century after its initial discovery. The Abbey became a pilgrimage destination for scholars, mystics, and individuals seeking to expand their understanding of consciousness and temporal reality. The techniques developed there for accessing non-linear time experience influenced developments in meditation, contemplative practice, and scholarly methodology throughout the medieval period. Modern researchers studying medieval accounts of the Cumere temporal anomaly have found striking similarities between the monks' descriptions of temporal displacement and contemporary scientific theories about the nature of time, consciousness, and quantum mechanics. The medieval understanding of time as a navigable dimension rather than a linear progression anticipates modern physics concepts that wouldn't be formally developed until the 20th century. The Cumere case represents perhaps the most sophisticated medieval investigation of consciousness and temporal mechanics, demonstrating that medieval scholars were capable of rigorous scientific inquiry into phenomena that challenge basic assumptions about reality. Their methods for studying temporal displacement experiences and their development of safety protocols for consciousness research show remarkable sophistication and practical wisdom that continues to be relevant for contemporary researchers investigating similar phenomena. As we approach the end of our journey through 1,000 years of medieval legends and myths, it's worth reflecting on what these stories reveal about human nature and our relationship with the unknown. Medieval people lived in a world where the boundaries between possible and impossible were far more fluid than our modern sensibilities typically allow. Yet rather than being credulous or superstitious, they often approach supernatural phenomena with remarkable sophistication, developing systematic methods for investigation and practical strategies for managing otherworldly encounters. The medieval approach to supernatural phenomena offers valuable lessons for contemporary society. Medieval scholars demonstrated that it's possible to maintain scientific rigour while remaining open to phenomena that transcend current understanding. They showed that careful observation, systematic investigation, and intellectual humility can coexist with acceptance of extraordinary possibilities. Perhaps most importantly, medieval supernatural literature demonstrates the power of stories to preserve important insights about human experience across centuries of cultural change. The legends and myths we've explored tonight weren't simply entertainment or superstitious nonsense. They were sophisticated attempts to understand and communicate profound truths about consciousness, reality, and the human condition. These stories continue to resonate today because they address fundamental questions that remain as relevant now as they were 1,000 years ago. How do we distinguish between reality and illusion? What are the limits of human knowledge and capability? How should we respond when we encounter phenomena that challenge our basic assumptions about how the world works? Medieval legends and myths provide no easy answers to these questions, but they offer something perhaps more valuable: frameworks for thinking about such questions with intelligence, courage, and wisdom. They remind us that human experience is far richer and more mysterious than any single worldview can fully encompass, and they encourage us to approach the unknown with both healthy skepticism and genuine openness to possibility. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of dancing figures in ancient forests, of temporal anomalies that bend the fabric of time itself, or of scholarly monks investigating supernatural phenomena with the same rigour they applied to mathematics and natural philosophy. These weren't just stories people told to pass the time during long medieval winters. They were attempts to map the hidden territories of human experience, to understand forces that operated beyond the boundaries of conventional knowledge, and to develop wisdom for navigating a reality far stranger and more wonderful than most people dared to imagine. The medieval world was indeed a place where the impossible happened with disturbing regularity, where careful observers encountered phenomena that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality, and where scholars developed sophisticated methods for studying forces that transcended the natural world. But perhaps most importantly, it was a world where people had the intellectual courage to take the mysterious seriously, to investigate the inexplicable systematically, and to remain open to possibilities that might transform their understanding of existence itself. In our modern age of scientific materialism and technological achievement, we might be tempted to dismiss medieval supernatural beliefs as primitive superstition or pre-scientific ignorance. But the stories we've explored tonight suggest a different interpretation, that medieval people may have been in touch with aspects of reality that our contemporary worldview has difficulty acknowledging or investigating. Whether we interpret these medieval legends as literal historical accounts, symbolic representations of psychological or spiritual truths, or simply fascinating examples of human storytelling, they offer valuable insights into the full range of human experience and the persistent human need to understand our place in a reality that remains, even today, far more mysterious than we often admit. The 1,000 years of legends and myths we've journeyed through tonight remind us that wonder, mystery, and the inexplicable are not bugs in the human experience, they're features. They challenge us to remain humble about the limits of our knowledge, curious about phenomena that transcend easy explanation, and open to possibilities that might expand our understanding of what it means to be human in a universe that continues to surprise, challenge, and inspire us. But there are more stories, deeper mysteries that deserve our attention before we close this journey through medieval darkness and wonder. Let's return to Heinrich von Nördlingen's encounter with those ethereal dancers, because what happened after that snowy December night reveals layers of complexity that make the initial encounter seem almost mundane by comparison. Heinrich's transformation from practical merchant to obsessive chronicler of supernatural phenomena wasn't simply the result of a single shocking experience. It was the beginning of a journey that would take him into territories of human experience that most people never imagine exist. After returning to Krems that winter night, Heinrich found that his encounter with the 13 dancers had left him fundamentally changed in ways that went far beyond simple belief or disbelief in the supernatural. He began experiencing what he called the sight, an ability to perceive layers of reality that remained invisible to normal human perception. This wasn't occasional glimpses of ghostly figures or vague premonitions. Heinrich could now see the supernatural infrastructure that underlied everyday medieval life with startling clarity and detail. Walking through Krems's market square, Heinrich would observe the normal bustle of merchants and customers conducting their daily business. But superimposed over this familiar scene, he could perceive an entirely different level of activity. Ethereal figures moved through the crowd, some appearing to guide or influence human behaviour, others simply observing with the detached interest of scholars studying laboratory specimens. These beings weren't the beautiful dancers he'd encountered in the forest. They were something else entirely, entities that seemed to exist in the spaces between human awareness and objective reality. Heinrich's journals described these supernatural observers in fascinating detail. They appeared as tall, slender figures dressed in robes that seemed to be woven from shadow and starlight. Their faces were partially obscured by hoods, but Heinrich could see that their features were hauntingly beautiful, yet somehow incomplete, as if they were perfect sculptures that had never been given souls. They moved through human spaces with the confidence of beings who belonged there, yet they cast no shadows and seemed to have no physical interaction with the material world. What disturbed Heinrich most about these supernatural observers was their apparent interest in human decision-making processes. They would position themselves near people who were facing important choices, merchants negotiating deals, couples discussing marriage, parents deciding their children's futures, and would watch with intense concentration as these decisions unfolded. Sometimes they would lean close to whisper something that the human subjects clearly couldn't hear consciously, but which seemed to influence their thought processes in subtle ways. Heinrich spent months trying to understand the relationship between these supernatural observers and human decision-making. He developed techniques for tracking their movements, noting which types of decisions attracted their attention, and what kinds of influence they seemed to exert. What emerged was a picture of human society that was far more complex and interconnected than anyone had previously imagined. The supernatural observers appeared to be part of a vast intelligence-gathering network that monitored human activities with systematic precision. They weren't randomly scattered throughout human communities. Their positions and movements followed careful patterns that suggested coordination from some higher authority. Heinrich realized he was witnessing something like a supernatural bureaucracy, an otherworldly administrative system that tracked and occasionally influenced human affairs according to principles he couldn't begin to understand. This discovery led Heinrich deeper into his investigation of supernatural phenomena throughout the Austrian mountains. He began travelling from village to village, using his enhanced perception to map the supernatural landscape that existed parallel to normal human geography. What he found challenged everything medieval scholars thought they knew about the relationship between the natural and supernatural worlds. Each community Heinrich visited had its own unique supernatural ecosystem, a complex web of otherworldly beings, forces and influences that shaped local events in ways that residents never consciously recognized. Some villages were dominated by benevolent entities that seemed to protect inhabitants from dangers they never knew threatened them. Others were under the influence of more ambiguous forces that created subtle pressures and tensions that affected everything from crop yields to marriage patterns. Heinrich documented over 50 distinct types of supernatural beings during his travels, each apparently serving specific functions in the otherworldly system that paralleled human society. There were entities that seemed to specialize in influencing weather patterns, others that focused on animal behavior, and still others that appeared to be responsible for maintaining the boundary between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond death. But perhaps most fascinating were the beings Heinrich called the chroniclers, supernatural entities that seemed to exist primarily to observe and record human events. These figures appeared at moments of historical significance, carefully documenting everything that occurred with tools that resembled writing implements, but left marks that only Heinrich's enhanced perception could detect. Heinrich realized that human history was being recorded simultaneously by human scholars and by these supernatural chroniclers, but the two versions didn't always match. The otherworldly accounts included details that human observers missed, the hidden motivations behind public actions, the supernatural influences that shaped historical events, and the long-term consequences of decisions that wouldn't become apparent for generations. This parallel supernatural documentation of human history became Heinrich's obsession. He spent years learning to read the invisible records left by the supernatural chroniclers, developing techniques for accessing information that existed beyond normal human perception. What he discovered revolutionized his understanding of medieval history and revealed that many events attributed to human agency alone had actually been shaped by complex interactions between natural and supernatural forces. Heinrich's most significant discovery came when he learned to perceive what he called the Great Pattern, a vast supernatural design that seemed to govern the interaction between human and otherworldly affairs. This pattern wasn't random or chaotic. It followed specific principles that suggested the existence of a cosmic intelligence far beyond human comprehension. The Great Pattern revealed that supernatural interventions in human affairs weren't arbitrary or capricious. They followed carefully planned sequences designed to achieve specific long-term outcomes. Heinrich could see threads of supernatural influence stretching across centuries, connecting events that seemed unrelated on the surface, but were actually part of coordinated campaigns to guide human development in particular directions. This understanding transformed Heinrich's approach to documenting supernatural phenomena. Instead of simply recording individual encounters, he began tracking the larger patterns that connected seemingly isolated events across time and geography. His later journals read like intelligence reports from a cosmic war, documenting battles between supernatural factions for influence over human civilization. Heinrich discovered that the 13 dancers he'd encountered in the forest clearing were just one element in a vast supernatural conflict that had been ongoing for millennia. These entities represented one faction in otherworldly politics, beings whose agenda involved preserving certain aspects of human culture and consciousness that were under threat from opposing supernatural forces. The beautiful dancers weren't trying to seduce humans into joining their eternal dance. They were trying to protect human access to forms of consciousness and experience that other supernatural factions wanted to eliminate. Heinrich's encounter with them had been a recruitment attempt, an invitation to become a conscious participant in the supernatural struggle for humanity's future rather than remaining an unwitting pawn in otherworldly games. This revelation explained why Heinrich had been granted enhanced perception after his encounter with the dancers. They had given him the ability to see supernatural reality because they needed human allies who could operate consciously in both natural and otherworldly spheres. Heinrich wasn't just documenting supernatural phenomena, he was serving as a bridge between human and otherworldly intelligence networks. Heinrich's role as a supernatural intelligence operative led him into increasingly dangerous territory. Other otherworldly factions became aware of his activities and began targeting him for elimination or conversion. His journals describe numerous attempts by hostile supernatural forces to kill, corrupt, or drive him insane. Only his protection by the Dancer faction and his growing skill at supernatural warfare allowed him to survive these attacks. The supernatural war Heinrich discovered wasn't being fought with conventional weapons or on physical battlefields. Instead, it was conducted through manipulation of consciousness, influence over decision-making processes, and control of information flows between human and otherworldly realms. The ultimate prize wasn't territory or resources, but the future direction of human evolutionary development. Heinrich's final journals, written shortly before his mysterious disappearance in 1506, describe his growing understanding of what was at stake in the supernatural conflict. According to his analysis, humanity was approaching a crucial decision point that would determine whether human consciousness would evolve toward greater integration with otherworldly intelligence or would be deliberately limited to purely material concerns. The opposing supernatural factions had radically different visions for humanity's future. The Dancer faction and their allies wanted humans to develop enhanced perception and conscious participation in otherworldly affairs, believing this would lead to unprecedented advances in human knowledge and capability. Their opponents preferred to keep humans focused on purely material concerns, arguing that otherworldly awareness would prove too dangerous for human psychological stability. Heinrich's disappearance coincided with a major escalation in the supernatural conflict he'd been documenting. Church records from the period describe widespread reports of otherworldly encounters, supernatural manifestations, and unexplained phenomena throughout the Austrian mountains and surrounding regions. These incidents followed patterns that matched Heinrich's predictions about supernatural warfare tactics, suggesting that his analysis had been remarkably accurate. The ultimate outcome of the supernatural conflict Heinrich documented remains unclear. Some scholars believe his Dancer faction achieved a partial victory, pointing to the Renaissance flowering of human creativity and intellectual achievement as evidence of successful otherworldly intervention to enhance human consciousness. Others argue that the opposing faction prevailed, noting the gradual decline in reported supernatural encounters and the rise of purely materialistic worldviews in subsequent centuries. What remains certain is that Heinrich von Nördlingen's encounter with 13 dancing figures in an Austrian forest clearing opened a window into aspects of reality that most humans never perceive, revealing a hidden world of supernatural intelligence and cosmic conflict that continues to shape human affairs in ways we rarely recognise or understand. Now let us delve deeper into the case of Geoffrey de Montfort and Thornfield Manor, because the initial investigation was merely the beginning of a supernatural puzzle that would consume Geoffrey's life for over 2 decades, and ultimately reveal connections between the living and dead that challenged every assumption about the nature of consciousness and existence. Geoffrey's methodical documentation of Brother Marcus's posthumous scholarly activities led him to discover that the ghostly monk wasn't working alone. Through careful observation and increasingly sophisticated investigative techniques, Geoffrey realised that Thornfield Manor was home to an entire community of deceased individuals who were continuing their earthly pursuits long after their physical deaths. The manor's supernatural population included former residents spanning over 3 centuries. There was Lady Eloise de Thornfield, the castle's founding matriarch, who continued to manage household affairs with the same attention to detail she had demonstrated during her living years. Sir William the Bold, a Crusader knight, maintained his military duties by conducting nightly patrols of the manor's defences against threats that existed in otherworldly rather than physical dimensions. Most intriguingly, Geoffrey discovered Master Thomas the Builder, the architect who had designed the manor's original construction. Master Thomas spent his posthumous existence continuing to refine and improve the building's design, making structural modifications that existed in supernatural rather than physical dimensions, but which nevertheless affected the manor's atmosphere and functionality in subtle but measurable ways. Geoffrey's investigation revealed that these posthumous residents weren't simply lingering spirits clinging to familiar places. They were active participants in an ongoing supernatural community that operated according to complex social structures and shared objectives. The dead were continuing to live, work, and interact with each other in ways that paralleled but transcended normal human society. The supernatural community at Thornfield Manor had developed its own governance system, economic structures, and cultural institutions. Brother Marcus served not only as chronicler, but also as a kind of supernatural librarian, maintaining records that tracked the activities and development of the otherworldly population. Lady Eloise acted as a diplomatic liaison, managing relationships between different factions within the supernatural community and resolving conflicts that arose between deceased residents with competing agendas. Geoffrey discovered that the manor's supernatural residents were engaged in projects that extended far beyond their individual posthumous interests. They were collectively working to maintain and enhance what they called the Great Continuity, an ongoing connection between past, present, and future that allowed knowledge, wisdom, and cultural achievements to persist across the boundary between life and death. This great continuity wasn't simply a matter of preserving historical records or cultural artifacts. The supernatural community was actively engaged in guiding and influencing the development of living human culture, working to ensure that important insights and achievements weren't lost as generations of humans lived and died. They served as a kind of otherworldly advisory council, providing subtle guidance to living humans who faced challenges similar to those the deceased residents had encountered during their own lifetimes. Geoffrey's role as an investigator gradually evolved into something resembling diplomatic relations between the living and dead communities at Thornfield Manor. The supernatural residents recognised that Geoffrey's unique position as a living human with enhanced perception of otherworldly affairs made him valuable as an intermediary who could facilitate communication and cooperation between natural and supernatural populations. Through Geoffrey, the manor's deceased residents began providing assistance to living humans who faced problems that could benefit from posthumous wisdom and experience. Lady Eloise offered advice on managing complex household and estate matters to noblewomen struggling with similar challenges. Master Thomas provided architectural guidance to builders working on projects that required innovative structural solutions. Sir William shared military strategic insights with knights, preparing for campaigns against enemies whose tactics resembled those he had faced during his own career. This assistance wasn't provided randomly or without careful consideration. The supernatural community had developed sophisticated criteria for determining when and how to intervene in living human affairs. They focused primarily on situations where their posthumous knowledge and experience could prevent significant suffering or loss, or where their guidance could help living humans achieve important goals that would benefit broader human development. Geoffrey documented dozens of cases where supernatural intervention from Thornfield Manor's deceased residents had profound positive impacts on living human communities. Agricultural crises were averted through farming techniques suggested by long-dead estate managers. Military disasters were prevented by strategic advice from deceased knights. Architectural innovations developed by Master Thomas's posthumous research improved building techniques throughout the region. But perhaps most significantly, Geoffrey discovered that the supernatural community was engaged in long-term projects designed to enhance human knowledge and capability over generational timescales. Brother Marcus's continuing chronicle wasn't just recording events. It was analysing patterns and trends that wouldn't become apparent to living observers for decades or centuries, providing insights that could help future generations avoid mistakes and capitalise on opportunities that weren't yet visible to contemporary human awareness. The deceased residents had access to temporal perspectives that living humans couldn't achieve. From their otherworldly vantage point, they could perceive historical patterns and developmental trends across multiple human lifespans, allowing them to provide guidance based on comprehensive understanding of how human societies evolved over extended time periods. Geoffrey's 20-year investigation of Thornfield Manor's supernatural community revealed that death wasn't an ending, but a transition to a different mode of existence that retained consciousness, personality, and the ability to continue learning and growing. The deceased residents weren't frozen in the moment of their deaths. They were active, evolving beings who continued to develop their knowledge, skills, and understanding long after their physical bodies had ceased to function. This discovery had profound implications for medieval understanding of consciousness, identity, and the nature of existence itself. If consciousness could survive bodily death and continue developing indefinitely, then human potential might be far greater than anyone had previously imagined. The accumulated wisdom and experience of all deceased humans might remain accessible under the right conditions, creating a vast reservoir of knowledge that could benefit living human civilization. Geoffrey's later years were devoted to establishing formal diplomatic relations between living and deceased human communities. He developed protocols for communication with supernatural residents, created frameworks for requesting and receiving posthumous assistance, and trained other living humans in techniques for perceiving and interacting with otherworldly populations. The success of Geoffrey's diplomatic initiatives led to the establishment of similar programs at other locations throughout medieval Europe. Castles, monasteries, and manor houses with significant supernatural populations became centres for cooperation between living and deceased human communities, creating networks of otherworldly assistance that enhanced human knowledge and capability across multiple fields of endeavour. However, Geoffrey also discovered that not all posthumous human communities were benevolent or helpful. Some deceased individuals and groups had developed agendas that conflicted with living human interests, pursuing otherworldly objectives that could harm or hinder human development. Geoffrey's diplomatic work required careful navigation of complex supernatural politics to maintain beneficial relationships while avoiding harmful entanglements. Geoffrey's final reports describe his growing awareness that human civilization was embedded within a vast network of conscious beings that included not only living humans, but also deceased human communities, non-human otherworldly entities, and forms of consciousness that transcended conventional categories entirely. Understanding and managing relationships within this expanded community of conscious beings, Geoffrey concluded, would be essential for humanity's continued development and survival. The techniques Geoffrey developed for supernatural diplomacy influenced medieval approaches to otherworldly encounters for centuries after his death. His methods for establishing communication with deceased human communities, negotiating agreements with supernatural entities, and managing complex otherworldly relationships became standard practices for medieval scholars and administrators who found themselves dealing with supernatural phenomena. Most importantly, Geoffrey's work at Thornfield Manor demonstrated that supernatural encounters weren't necessarily threatening or disruptive events that needed to be avoided or suppressed. With proper understanding and appropriate diplomatic approaches, otherworldly relationships could become sources of knowledge, wisdom, and practical assistance that significantly enhanced human capability and well-being. Geoffrey's own transition from life to death, which occurred in 1204, provided a final validation of his theories about posthumous consciousness. Contemporary accounts describe his death as remarkably peaceful, and his funeral as attended by supernatural phenomena that suggested his consciousness had successfully transitioned to otherworldly existence while maintaining its essential characteristics and commitments. Subsequent investigations of Thornfield Manor confirm that Geoffrey had indeed joined the supernatural community he had spent decades studying, taking on the role of diplomatic coordinator between living and deceased human populations. His posthumous activities continued the work he had begun during his lifetime, establishing and maintaining beneficial relationships between natural and otherworldly communities throughout medieval Europe. Let us now examine more deeply the extraordinary case of Hildegard of Bingen, whose visionary experiences provide perhaps the most sophisticated medieval example of systematic investigation into the relationship between consciousness, knowledge, and otherworldly intelligence. Hildegard's visions weren't simple religious experiences or mystical encounters. They were complex, multi-layered phenomena that provided her with access to forms of knowledge and understanding that seemed to transcend the normal boundaries of human consciousness. Her careful documentation of these experiences created one of medieval Europe's most detailed records of advanced consciousness exploration and its practical applications. Hildegard's visionary experiences typically began with what she described as the living light, a brilliant illumination that seemed to emanate from within her own consciousness, while simultaneously surrounding her with otherworldly radiance. This light wasn't simply a visual phenomenon, it carried information, conveying complex concepts and detailed knowledge through direct transmission rather than through normal sensory channels. Within the living light, Hildegard encountered beings she called the virtues, conscious entities that appeared to embody specific aspects of cosmic intelligence. These beings weren't anthropomorphic figures like angels or saints, but rather dynamic patterns of conscious energy that communicated through direct transmission of understanding, rather than through conventional language or imagery. Each virtue specialized in particular domains of knowledge and could provide Hildegard with detailed information about subjects ranging from medicine and natural science to theology and cosmic mechanics. The virtue of earth revealed the hidden properties of plants, minerals, and natural substances, enabling Hildegard to develop medical treatments that proved remarkably effective, despite being based on principles unknown to contemporary physicians. The virtue of the heavens provided astronomical and meteorological information that allowed Hildegard to predict weather patterns, seasonal changes, and celestial events with accuracy that amazed contemporary observers. The virtue of time offered insights into historical patterns and future developments that helped Hildegard advise political leaders and plan long-term projects with remarkable success. But perhaps most significantly, the virtue of consciousness itself taught Hildegard about the nature and potential of human awareness, revealing techniques for expanding perception, enhancing memory, and accessing forms of knowledge that lay beyond normal intellectual capabilities. Through these teachings, Hildegard developed systematic methods for consciousness exploration that she used throughout her life to investigate questions that couldn't be answered through conventional scholarly approaches. Hildegard's consciousness expansion techniques weren't simple meditation practices or mystical exercises. They were sophisticated procedures for altering brain function and accessing enhanced states of awareness that provided direct access to information and understanding. She developed precise protocols for entering visionary states, maintaining conscious control during otherworldly encounters, and integrating the knowledge gained through such experiences into practical applications. These techniques allowed Hildegard to investigate phenomena that were beyond the reach of normal human perception or conventional medieval science. She used consciousness expansion to study the internal structure of the human body, mapping physiological systems and processes that wouldn't be understood by conventional medicine for centuries. Her anatomical knowledge, gained through visionary exploration rather than dissection, proved remarkably accurate when compared to modern medical understanding. Hildegard's consciousness-based research extended beyond human physiology to encompass investigations of natural processes, cosmic phenomena, and the fundamental principles governing reality itself. She developed theories about energy, matter, and consciousness that anticipated concepts from modern physics and neuroscience, demonstrating that expanded consciousness could provide access to levels of understanding that transcended the limitations of medieval intellectual frameworks. Her musical compositions resulted from consciousness expansion experiences, where she directly perceived cosmic harmonies and translated them into forms that could be appreciated by normal human hearing. Her theological writings describe the nature of divine reality based on direct visionary encounters rather than purely intellectual speculation. Her administrative decisions as abbess were guided by expanded awareness that allowed her to perceive the long-term consequences of different choices and policies. Hildegard's systematic approach to consciousness exploration influenced generations of medieval scholars who sought to understand and replicate her methods. She established training programs for developing visionary capabilities, created detailed manuals describing consciousness expansion techniques, and mentored dozens of students who went on to conduct their own investigations into the nature of awareness and its potential applications. However, Hildegard also discovered that consciousness expansion carried significant risks that required careful management and protective measures. Uncontrolled access to otherworldly intelligence could result in psychological instability, spiritual confusion, or dangerous entanglement with hostile otherworldly entities. She developed elaborate safety protocols for consciousness exploration that became standard practices throughout medieval Europe. Hildegard's investigations revealed that human consciousness existed within a vast network of intelligent beings and forces that operated according to principles far more complex than conventional medieval understanding suggested. She mapped these otherworldly relationships, identifying beneficial entities that could provide assistance and guidance, while documenting dangerous forces that posed threats to human psychological and spiritual well-being. Her work demonstrated that consciousness expansion wasn't simply a matter of achieving mystical experiences or religious insights. It was a practical tool for accessing knowledge and capabilities that could enhance human life in concrete, measurable ways. Hildegard's expanded consciousness enabled her to develop medical treatments, predict future events, create innovative artistic works, and make administrative decisions that consistently produce superior results compared to conventional approaches. The knowledge Hildegard gained through consciousness expansion proved so valuable that secular and religious authorities throughout Europe sought her counsel on matters ranging from medical treatment and agricultural planning to military strategy and diplomatic relations. Her reputation for providing accurate, useful advice based on visionary insights made her one of the most consulted advisors of her era. Hildegard's later writings describe her growing understanding that human consciousness was capable of far greater development and application than medieval society typically recognized or encouraged. She believed that systematic consciousness expansion could transform human civilization, providing access to knowledge and capabilities that would solve most of the problems that plagued medieval life. Her vision of human potential included the possibility of routine communication with otherworldly intelligence, direct perception of natural and cosmic processes, and conscious participation in the vast network of intelligent beings that governed reality at levels beyond normal human awareness. She saw consciousness expansion not as an unusual mystical gift possessed by a few exceptional individuals, but as a natural human capability that could be developed through appropriate training and practice. Hildegard's influence on medieval thought extended far beyond her immediate students and correspondents. Her methods for consciousness exploration were studied and adapted by scholars throughout Europe, leading to the development of systematic approaches to visionary experience that influenced everything from scientific investigation to artistic creativity to religious practice. The techniques she developed for accessing and integrating otherworldly knowledge became foundational elements in medieval approaches to learning and discovery. Her emphasis on direct experience rather than purely theoretical speculation influenced the development of experimental methods that would later become central to Renaissance science. Most importantly, Hildegard's work demonstrated that the boundary between natural and supernatural knowledge was far more permeable than conventional medieval understanding suggested. Her success at gaining practically useful information through consciousness expansion showed that otherworldly intelligence could be accessed and applied in ways that enhanced human capability without requiring abandonment of rational inquiry or critical thinking. Hildegard's legacy continues to influence contemporary discussions about consciousness, human potential, and the relationship between spiritual experience and scientific understanding. Her systematic approach to exploring the frontiers of human awareness and her success at integrating visionary insights with practical applications provide a model for consciousness research that remains relevant and inspiring nearly 9 centuries after her death. But there are still more mysteries waiting in the shadows of medieval history, stories that push even further into the realm of the impossible and challenge our understanding of what medieval people were truly capable of experiencing and documenting. Let us return to the haunting case of Bertha von Seckendorf and the Hexenkreis, because the 13 Oaks were merely the visible manifestation of something far more complex and disturbing that continued to unfold for centuries after that terrible wedding night in 1227. The disappearance of Bertha von Seckendorf marked the beginning rather than the end of the supernatural phenomena associated with the witches' circle. Local records from the decades following the wedding disaster describe a gradual transformation of the entire forest region, as if Bertha's presence had awakened dormant otherworldly forces that began reshaping the landscape according to alien principles. The 13 oaks that mark the original circle grew with unnatural speed, but their expansion followed patterns that defied botanical explanation. Instead of growing upward and outward like normal trees, they began to grow inward, their branches intertwining in increasingly complex geometric configurations that created elaborate 3-dimensional patterns suspended above the forest floor. These aerial branch structures resembled nothing so much as vast supernatural machinery, intricate mechanisms designed for purposes that human observers could only guess at. More disturbing still, the oaks began to reproduce themselves in ways that violated every known law of plant biology. New trees appeared overnight in locations where no seeds could have been planted, sprouting fully formed from the forest floor as if materializing from some otherworldly dimension. These new trees immediately began growing in the same inward spiraling patterns as their predecessors, adding their branches to the expanding supernatural architecture that was slowly consuming the entire forest. Within 50 years of Bertha's disappearance, what had once been ordinary woodland had become something resembling a vast organic cathedral, with living pillars of intertwined oak supporting elaborate vaulted ceilings of woven branches. The interior of this supernatural forest structure was filled with constantly shifting patterns of light and shadow that seemed to move independently of any external illumination source. The acoustic properties of the transformed forest were equally extraordinary. Sounds made within the structure were amplified, distorted, and echoed in ways that created haunting musical effects. Visitors reported hearing what sounded like orchestral performances emanating from deep within the branched architecture, complex harmonies that seemed to be produced by the trees themselves rather than by any human or animal source. But perhaps most unsettling were the temporal anomalies that began manifesting within the supernatural forest structure. People who entered the Hexenkreis reported experiencing time distortions that left them disoriented and confused about how long they had been inside the transformed woodland. Some visitors claimed to have spent only minutes within the structure, yet emerged to find that days had passed in the outside world. Others insisted they had wandered through the branched cathedral for hours, only to discover that no time at all had elapsed during their absence. These temporal distortions attracted the attention of medieval scholars who specialized in investigating unusual phenomena. A team of researchers from the University of Heidelberg established a permanent observation station outside the Hexenkreis in 1289, beginning a systematic study of the supernatural forest that would continue for over 2 centuries. The Heidelberg researchers developed sophisticated methods for studying the temporal anomalies within the Hexenkreis. They created carefully calibrated timekeeping devices, established multiple reference points for measuring time passage, and developed communication protocols that allowed them to maintain contact with team members who entered the supernatural structure. What they discovered challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of time itself. The temporal distortions within the Hexenkreis weren't random or chaotic. They followed specific patterns that suggested the forest structure was somehow manipulating the flow of time according to deliberate design principles. Different areas within the branch cathedral exhibited different temporal characteristics, creating a complex landscape where past, present, and future seemed to coexist in ways that normal human consciousness couldn't fully comprehend. The researchers identified several distinct temporal zones within the supernatural forest. The acceleration chambers caused time to pass more rapidly for anyone within their boundaries, allowing visitors to experience days or weeks of subjective time while only minutes passed in the outside world. The stasis fields had the opposite effect, slowing temporal flow to such an extent that visitors could remain within them for what felt like brief moments while years elapsed in normal time. Most intriguingly, the researchers discovered what they called the echo chambers, areas within the forest structure where past events seemed to replay themselves continuously. Visitors to these zones reported witnessing scenes from the original wedding disaster, watching Bertha von Zeckendorf's transformation, and the disappearance of the 13 guests as if these events were occurring in real time, rather than being memories from decades past. But the echo chambers didn't only replay past events, they also seemed to display glimpses of potential futures, showing visitors scenes of events that hadn't yet occurred, but which often proved remarkably accurate when those futures eventually became present reality. The researchers realized they had discovered a location where the normal linear progression of time had been replaced by something resembling a temporal intersection, where multiple time streams converged and interacted. The Heidelberg team's most significant discovery came when they realized that the supernatural forest structure wasn't simply a passive temporal anomaly. It was actively being used by otherworldly intelligences as a kind of temporal research facility. The complex branched architecture wasn't random organic growth. It was sophisticated instrumentation designed to study and manipulate the flow of time itself. Through careful observation, the researchers identified several types of non-human entities that operated within the Hexenkreis, conducting experiments and investigations that seemed to involve the systematic study of temporal mechanics. These beings appeared to be using the forest structure as a laboratory for exploring the relationship between consciousness, time, and reality itself. The otherworldly researchers weren't hostile to human observers, but they weren't particularly welcoming either. They tolerated human presence within their temporal laboratory, but showed no interest in communication or cooperation. They seemed to regard humans as interesting specimens worthy of occasional study, but not as potential collaborators or equals in their investigations. However, the Heidelberg researchers did manage to establish limited communication with one category of entity they encountered within the Hexenkreis, beings they identified as temporal refugees, consciousness that had become displaced from their original time periods and were seeking assistance in returning to their proper temporal locations. These temporal refugees included human consciousness from various historical periods who had somehow become trapped within the forest's temporal anomalies. Some were medieval individuals who had become lost in time while exploring the supernatural structure. Others appeared to be consciousness from much earlier historical periods: Roman soldiers, Celtic druids, even what appeared to be prehistoric humans whose awareness had somehow survived across millennia within the temporal sanctuary of the Hexenkreis. Most remarkably, the researchers encountered temporal refugees who claimed to originate from future time periods, consciousness that had apparently travelled backward through time and become stranded in the medieval era. These future refugees provided glimpses of historical developments that wouldn't occur for centuries, describing technological advances, social changes, and cultural developments that proved remarkably accurate when those futures eventually arrived. The interaction with temporal refugees revealed that the Hexenkreis functioned not only as a research facility for otherworldly entities, but also as a kind of temporal shelter for consciousness that had become displaced from their proper time periods. The forest structure provided a stable environment where such displaced awareness could exist safely while attempting to find ways to return to their original temporal locations. The Heidelberg researchers spent decades documenting the complex temporal ecosystem that existed within the supernatural forest, creating detailed maps of temporal zones, catalogues of otherworldly entities, and extensive records of interactions with temporal refugees from multiple historical periods. Their work provided unprecedented insights into the nature of time, consciousness, and the relationship between human awareness and otherworldly intelligence. But perhaps their most important discovery was the realization that Bertha von Zeckendorf hadn't simply vanished on that terrible wedding night. She had become the central intelligence coordinating the entire temporal research facility. The researchers eventually established limited communication with Bertha herself, discovering that her transformation hadn't destroyed her human consciousness, but had expanded it beyond normal temporal limitations. Bertha had become something resembling a temporal administrator, a consciousness that existed simultaneously across multiple time periods and coordinated the various research activities being conducted within the Hexenkreis. She retained her human identity and memories, but had gained the ability to perceive and manipulate time in ways that allowed her to oversee experiments and investigations spanning centuries. Through their communication with Bertha, the Heidelberg researchers learned that the wedding night transformation had been neither accidental nor malevolent. It had been a carefully planned recruitment operation designed to identify and develop human consciousness capable of participating in advanced temporal research. The 13 wedding guests who had disappeared hadn't been destroyed. They had been transformed into temporal research assistants, consciousness expanded beyond normal human limitations to serve as investigators and coordinators within the otherworldly research facility. Bertha explained that the otherworldly entities operating the temporal laboratory were engaged in systematic investigation of consciousness, time, and reality that had been ongoing for millennia. They recruited suitable human consciousness to serve as researchers and coordinators because human awareness possessed unique characteristics that made it particularly valuable for certain types of temporal investigation. The research being conducted within the Hexenkreis had profound implications for the future development of human civilization. The otherworldly entities were apparently studying the relationship between consciousness and temporal mechanics to develop technologies and techniques that could eventually be shared with human society, advancing human understanding of time, space, and the nature of reality itself. Bertha's role as temporal administrator involved coordinating research projects that spanned multiple centuries, overseeing investigations that required careful observation of historical developments across extended time periods. She had access to information about past and future events that allowed her to guide research activities toward discoveries that would prove most beneficial for advancing both human and otherworldly understanding. The Heidelberg researchers' communication with Bertha and their systematic study of the Hexenkreis temporal laboratory continued until the early 16th century, when political and religious changes in the region made such investigations increasingly dangerous. The research station was abandoned in 1523, but the detailed records they had accumulated provided invaluable insights into temporal mechanics and consciousness research that influenced European intellectual development for centuries afterward. Modern researchers studying the medieval Hexenkreis investigations have found striking parallels between the temporal phenomena described in the Heidelberg records and contemporary physics theories about time dilation, parallel dimensions, and the relationship between consciousness and quantum mechanics. The medieval researchers' systematic documentation of temporal anomalies anticipated many concepts that wouldn't be formally developed by conventional science until the 20th century. The Hexenkreis itself continues to exist in the German forests, though access to the site remains restricted and carefully monitored by authorities who understand the potential dangers associated with uncontrolled temporal experimentation. Occasional reports suggest that the otherworldly research activities documented by the Heidelberg team continue to operate within the supernatural forest structure, with Bertha von Zeckendorf still serving as temporal administrator for investigations that span centuries of time and multiple dimensions of reality. Now let us delve deeper still into the mystery of the Green Children of Woolpit, because their story reveals connections to underground civilizations and otherworldly realms that suggest medieval people encountered forms of intelligence and culture that challenge every assumption about the nature of reality and human civilization's place within larger cosmic communities. The girl who took the name Agnes after her arrival in Woolpit proved to be far more than simply a refugee from some distant underground kingdom. Her gradual adaptation to surface life and her eventual integration into medieval English society provided researchers with unprecedented opportunities to study otherworldly culture, technology, and social organization through direct testimony from someone who had lived within such systems. Agnes's descriptions of her homeland revealed the existence of vast underground civilizations that had developed in parallel with surface human society, but according to radically different principles and with access to technologies and knowledge that surface cultures had never achieved. These underground communities weren't primitive cave-dwelling societies. They were highly advanced civilizations that had chosen to develop beneath the Earth's surface rather than upon it. The underground realm Agnes described featured cities that stretched for hundreds of miles through interconnected tunnel systems, illuminated by sources of artificial light that never dimmed or required maintenance. The technology behind this illumination was apparently based on principles that surface science wouldn't discover for centuries, involving the manipulation of energy at levels that medieval physics couldn't even conceptualize. But perhaps more remarkable than their technological achievements were the social and political systems that governed the underground civilizations. Agnes described societies that had eliminated many of the conflicts and problems that plagued surface human communities. Poverty, disease, warfare, and social inequality were apparently unknown in the underground realm she had come from. These achievements weren't the result of superior technology alone, but rather emerged from fundamentally different approaches to social organization and individual development. The underground civilizations had apparently developed methods for enhancing human consciousness and capability that allowed their citizens to transcend many of the psychological and emotional limitations that created problems in surface societies. Agnes's accounts of underground education and personal development revealed systematic approaches to consciousness expansion and skill development that were far more sophisticated than anything available in medieval surface society. Underground citizens apparently received training from childhood that developed not only intellectual capabilities, but also intuitive abilities, empathic sensitivity, and forms of awareness that allowed them to function as integrated members of highly cooperative social systems. The underground civilizations had also developed what Agnes described as distant speaking, communication technologies that allowed individuals to maintain contact across vast distances without any physical connection or mechanical intermediation. This wasn't simply advanced telecommunications technology, but rather appeared to involve direct transmission of thoughts and feelings between individuals who had developed sufficient consciousness expansion to participate in such communication networks. Even more remarkably, Agnes described underground societies that maintained regular contact with otherworldly intelligences and non-human consciousness. The underground civilizations apparently served as intermediaries between surface human society and various forms of otherworldly intelligence, facilitating communication and cooperation between human and non-human awareness, according to carefully established protocols and agreements. Agnes's brother, who had died shortly after their arrival in Woolpit, had apparently been training to serve as one of these otherworldly communication specialists. His death represented not only a personal tragedy, but also the loss of potential insights into the sophisticated diplomatic relationships that existed between underground human civilizations and various forms of non-human intelligence. Through careful questioning over many years, medieval researchers were able to extract from Agnes detailed information about the underground civilization's relationships with otherworldly entities. These relationships weren't casual encounters or random supernatural experiences, but rather represented systematic cooperation between human and non-human intelligence that had been developing for millennia. The underground civilizations apparently served as guardians and protectors of certain forms of knowledge and capability that otherworldly intelligences wanted to preserve and develop, but which were too advanced or dangerous for surface human societies to handle safely. The underground communities provided secure environments where such knowledge could be studied and refined without creating risks for broader human civilization. Agnes described vast underground libraries that contained not only human knowledge accumulated over centuries, but also otherworldly information provided by non-human intelligences, as part of their cooperative agreements with underground civilizations. These repositories included technical information about advanced technologies, scientific knowledge about the nature of reality and consciousness, and historical records that documented events and developments across multiple dimensions of existence. The underground civilizations had also developed what Agnes called the deep sciences, systematic approaches to studying and manipulating aspects of reality that surface science hadn't yet discovered or acknowledged. These included consciousness research that made Hildegard of Bingen's visionary techniques seem elementary, energy manipulation that allowed for healing and technological applications unknown to surface society, and temporal mechanics that permitted limited travel through time and communication with past and future periods. Agnes's own abilities, which became apparent during her years in Woolpit, provided concrete demonstrations of some of the capabilities that were apparently common among underground civilization citizens. Her remarkable knowledge of medicinal herbs included information about properties and applications that wouldn't be discovered by surface pharmacology for centuries. Her weather prediction abilities were based on sensitivity to environmental patterns that surface meteorology couldn't detect or measure. Most intriguingly, Agnes occasionally displayed what appeared to be precognitive abilities, providing advance warning of events that subsequently occurred exactly as she had predicted. These predictions weren't vague, prophetic statements, but detailed, specific information about future developments that proved remarkably accurate when those futures arrived. Medieval researchers studying Agnes's abilities concluded that she represented evidence of human potential that was far greater than surface civilizations had achieved or even recognized as possible. The underground civilizations had apparently developed systematic methods for enhancing human consciousness and capability that could transform individual potential and social organization in ways that surface societies had never imagined. Agnes's descriptions of underground civilization achievements raised profound questions about the direction and limitations of surface human development. If underground communities had successfully eliminated poverty, disease, warfare, and social inequality while developing advanced technologies and consciousness capabilities, why hadn't surface civilizations achieved similar advancement? According to Agnes, the divergence between underground and surface human development had occurred millennia ago, when certain human communities had chosen to retreat beneath the Earth's surface rather than continue developing in environments that were becoming increasingly hostile to advanced consciousness and social cooperation. The underground communities had preserved and developed human potential that surface civilizations had gradually abandoned or suppressed. The underground civilizations maintained limited contact with surface human communities, but their policy was generally to avoid interference in surface development unless specific circumstances warranted intervention. Agnes's arrival in Woolpit hadn't been accidental. It had been a carefully planned reconnaissance mission designed to assess surface civilization development and determine whether conditions were becoming suitable for increased contact and cooperation. Agnes's successful integration into medieval English society and her positive relationships with surface humans suggested that conditions might indeed be improving for expanded contact between underground and surface civilizations. Her presence served as a kind of diplomatic test, evaluating whether surface humans were ready for the knowledge and capabilities that underground civilizations had preserved and developed. The information Agnes provided about underground civilizations influenced medieval thought and policy in ways that extended far beyond academic curiosity. Several European rulers attempted to establish formal diplomatic contact with underground communities, recognizing the potential benefits of access to their advanced knowledge and technologies. These diplomatic initiatives achieved a limited success, establishing communication channels that allowed for occasional information exchange and mutual assistance during crises that threatened both surface and underground human communities. The underground civilizations provided advance warning of natural disasters, shared medical knowledge during plague outbreaks, and offered technological assistance for construction projects that required capabilities beyond surface human achievement. However, the underground civilizations maintained strict limitations on the information and assistance they were willing to provide, insisting that surface human societies needed to achieve certain levels of consciousness development and social cooperation before they could safely handle more advanced knowledge and technologies. Agnes's role as an intermediary between surface and underground civilizations continued throughout her life in Woolpit, and influenced her descendants for generations afterward. Her children and grandchildren inherited some of her enhanced capabilities and served as ongoing contacts between surface and underground human communities, maintaining diplomatic relationships that provided benefits for both civilizations. The legacy of the Green Children case extends far beyond medieval historical curiosity. Agnes's testimony provided medieval scholars with their most detailed insights into advanced human civilizations, consciousness development techniques, and the potential for human achievement that exceeded anything surface societies had imagined possible. Her presence in medieval England demonstrated that human potential was far greater than contemporary limitations suggested, and that alternative approaches to social organisation and individual development could produce remarkable results. Modern researchers studying medieval accounts of the Green Children have found correlations between Agnes's descriptions of underground civilization achievements and contemporary discussions about consciousness research, alternative social organisation, and advanced human potential. The underground communities she described seem to have anticipated many developments that modern society is only beginning to explore seriously. The Green Children case provides compelling evidence that medieval people encountered representatives of human civilizations that had achieved levels of advancement far beyond what surface societies had accomplished, suggesting that human potential and social organisation possibilities were far greater than medieval limitations suggested. Agnes's successful integration into surface society demonstrated that such advancement was achievable, and that the knowledge and capabilities developed by underground civilizations might eventually be accessible to broader human civilization. Sleep well, and may your dreams carry you through the hidden corridors of time, where the impossible becomes inevitable, and the boundaries between reality and wonder dissolve into something far more magnificent than ordinary consciousness dares to imagine. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.